Hey guys, it's Byron here and welcome to Byron's Reviews. So it's now the month of May and that means it's time for the first episode of Request Month. A month dedicated to going over your requests. And to kick off this series of reviews, we have two NEO-GEO games, Last Resort and Magician Lord. But before we jump into those, I just have a couple of disclaimers. Number 1, I am looking at the versions of these games on the NEO-GEO X, which are kind of similar to the AES versions. And number 2, I haven't beaten these games or got very far in them. And you may be wondering, why is that? Well, the reason is simply because they are hard. That's kind of the tricky thing about reviewing NEO-GEO games sometimes, that with game reviews I like to get as far into the game as possible before reviewing them, but with games on this system, that point doesn't tend to be that far in. But with those things taken into account, let's look at these games on those terms, starting with Last Resort. Last Resort is a horizontal, futuristic styled shoot 'em up, in which, as you'd expect from a game of that kind, you control a ship going forward, shooting down oncoming enemies. When playing this game, I always feel so much energy pulsate off it, which, aided by a very fast pace, really keeps you on the ball. When playing NEO-GEO games in general, I always seem to get this vibe. They have an almost cinematic feel, especially compared to other consoles of its time like the Mega Drive or the Super Nintendo. That may sound like a weird thing to say, but hear me out. In the case of Last Resort, on top of the highly detailed city landscapes and the rocking music of the first stage, there are lots of other subtle details that really give the game such a large scope and feel. For example, in this first stage, there's a part where you enter an indoor location with a really red, mechanical looking aesthetic, and when that part of the game happens, the music changes to fit the tone, and you get such an awesome sense of progression, hence what I said earlier about it feeling kind of cinematic, and it just gives you an overall feeling that makes you go, hell yeah! So I think it's fair to say that the style of Last Resort is top notch, but on top of that, there's a gimmick with the gameplay that makes it even more fun. This is a smaller secondary ship you can acquire which floats around your main ship, and there are many different ways you can use this. I guess the basic use is that you can use it to fire in many different directions depending on the positioning of your main ship, which can just fire straight forwards. And when you get this twinned with all the different other items throughout the game that can fire many different kinds of projectiles in God knows what directions, this hell yeah feeling I mentioned earlier is escalated even further, and it is awesome. It gets to the point where all the things you're firing are filling up the whole screen, and it is so cool. But that's really just scratching the surface of the use of this secondary ship. If you hold A, you can charge this ship up so when you let go, it fires off in a certain direction. This is really handy for taking out lots of ships in one direction just with one quick blow, or just for more powerful attacks to defeat ships that require more than one hit. Another thing you can do is press B, which when you do that, the ship stays in one stationary position around your ship. But I didn't really understand why that was there at first, because the ship still shot in different directions depending on where your main ship was. But as I played the game more, I developed a tactic with this. Sometimes after pressing B to make the ship stay still, I'd hold A to charge it up so that when lots of other ships were coming towards me, I'd just literally make them fly into this secondary ship by holding it just close enough to them so they'd just take themselves out. It was very fun. In all seriousness though, I never used this tactic an awful lot, and I do think that the use of the B button isn't that necessary. As for the game's difficulty, in typical NEO-GEO fashion, it doesn't mess around. Yup, it may just be because I suck, but while it isn't the hardest shooter I've played, I never seem to get very far in Last Resort. And while I have seen NEO-GEO games with hard difficulties that don't exactly work, this one I'd say works very well. For the most part, when you die, it's your fault, so it is fair in that regard. But having said that, I did find myself making lots and lots of stupid mistakes, and I died a lot. So I soon found myself cranking the difficulty back down to easy mode with 3 continues. But if you do want to make the game a bit easier, from my very minimal experience of 2-player, that does make things a lot less hard, because now you have 2 ships working together to take more of the enemies out. But I do have a minor nitpick with the difficulty. As I said earlier, while I think that the progression of the game stylistically is really good, I think the progression of the difficulty at times is a tiny bit sporadic. For example, in the first stage, it stays at around the same level of difficulty for the most part, but then you encounter this tank, and when the tank comes into the picture, the difficulty goes from 1 to 100. I think I've only beaten this tank once, and if you do die when you're fighting the tank, you do get skipped past it, but I always lose a life there, so I wish it was more of a gradual progression in difficulty instead of going from here to here. Now let's bring this to my conclusion on Last Resort. Overall, I love this game, and I think if you're a fan of shoot 'em ups, you owe it to yourself to play this NEO-GEO classic. But if shooters aren't exactly your strong point, or you want a more easygoing, less intense game, I don't think this one's for you, and maybe skip it. So, going from one NEO-GEO game to another, let's check out Magician Lord. Magician Lord is a side-scrolling platformer in which you play as, you guessed it, a magician, and on your way you'll be shooting and taking out many different enemies. Now, unlike Last Resort, Magician Lord has quite a slow pace, as the magician you control doesn't really move very fast. This isn't necessarily a bad thing or a good thing, it's just a characteristic of the game that's worth taking note of. However, I'd say that stylistically, Magician Lord is even superior to Last Resort, and you know how much I love the style of that game. I think this is really due to how much creativity has gone into the stages and visuals. For example, there's a really cool treehouse stage and another stage where you go through what looks to be the insides of some kind of creature. There's lots of bloody, bony imagery and what looks to be stringy tendons on the walls, and it's quite grim but really cool to look at. Put this with upbeat, albeit eerie and atmospheric music, and you get a really cool vibe. The music is very fitting for a fantasy game of this kind too. I think that Magician Lord is a prime example of how NEO-GEO games tend to age really well. I'd say that if this game was released today, it'd still be praised for its visual style and its music, but it did all this back in 1990, which is absolutely crazy. But back to the gameplay, this isn't just an ordinary side-scroller. There are lots of other forms you can turn into in this game, other than just a standard magician, such as a fire-breathing dragon and a ninja. These are only 2 examples of these forms though, and they really show how the game has lots of a variety to keep things fresh. However, I will say that the game in terms of level design doesn't have the best sense of direction, as many times I found myself lost, not really knowing where to go to progress. While some people may like this for adding some kind of sort of puzzling element, I just found it to slow down the game even further. Another minor nitpick I have, or rather something I wish they would have added to the game, is that while you can shoot straight forward and up, I think it would have been really cool to be able to shoot diagonally. You can sort of do this when playing with the dragon form, but I think it would have been cool if all forms could do this. Now, it wouldn't be a NEO-GEO review if we didn't go on to the difficulty, and if you thought Last Resort's difficulty was bad, then oh boy, you haven't seen anything yet. While I'd say that Last Resort's difficulty came down to it being a genuinely well-designed, challenging game, I don't think I can really say the same thing for Magician Lord. The difficulty in this game seemed to come down to more trial and error and not necessarily skill. For example, there are lots of parts in the game where you'll come across these spiky balls on chains that come down from the ceiling to kill you, but there's no indication of where these things are going to pop up, and you can only really know they're there and avoid them by getting killed by them. Another example of this is a long drop down one section of the game where your character is just falling, trying to avoid these spikes on the way down, which you can only really know where they are by dying and not knowing to be in that position the next time you play. I guess you can get down by luck, like I did one time, but in general it's just trial and error. However, I just want to emphasise that trial and error isn't necessarily a bad thing in games. Many gamers like the style of having trial and error, and for example, games like Mega Man use it. However, in Magician Lord it is kind of undermined by the simple fact that you can't really lose. What I mean by this is that when you die, you get spawned right back where you were and you kind of have an unlimited supply of lives. Therefore, there just wasn't any incentive for me to really try, and I started just going through the game mindlessly, not really thinking. I guess I was in the following mindset of kind of like, well, I can't die, so instead of putting effort in, let's just mindlessly go forward and hope luck is on my side. I'm sure that the original arcade MVS version of the game didn't have this issue, but as for the AES or NEO-GEO X versions, I do think it is a major flaw in the game's design. It's such a shame because all the game would have really needed to fix it would have been an MVS or an arcade mode in which you actually stopped being able to play after dying a certain amount of times. But as it stands, you just press start and start playing the game, and there aren't really any other game modes. If you've seen any other video game reviews by me on Byron's Reviews, you would have probably heard me talk about how much I love risk versus reward elements in video games. But because of this flaw in Magician Lord, any kind of risk versus reward element is completely destroyed. So now let's conclude on this game. I'd say in general there are lots of really great things you can say about Magician Lord, and it has many cool ideas. But my issue regarding the difficulty of the game that I've just been talking about really takes away a lot of the enjoyment for me. I guess a good side of this flaw would be that if you're the kind of person who just wants to be able to get through a platformer and beat it, the fact that you do effectively have unlimited lives will enable you to do this. So if you want a game you can do that with, if you like the look of it, maybe give it a try. But for those who want a challenging, hard as nails side-scroller, which I think this game is trying to be, I'd either try and seek out ways to play the MVS version of the game, or maybe give this game a miss, because I think there are many other better, really hard side-scrollers you can play. It feels so frustrating to give Magician Lord this conclusion, because if it wasn't for this one flaw, I would have recommended it to most people and really liked the game. But I do think this flaw is kind of a biggie, so Magician Lord, Anyway, I hope you enjoyed these reviews. If you have any thoughts on these games, be sure to leave them in the comments below. And I'd like to thank Anthony, also known as Charlie Cat on YouTube, and FDurso224 on Atari Age, for recommending these games. I really appreciate it. And if you want to check out some things Anthony's doing, he runs a really cool thread on the Atari Age forums called the official NEO-GEO thread, which I'll link in the description. It's really awesome. So I look forward to seeing you guys next week on Request Month, but until then, I will see you later. Bye!